First of all, thank everybody who did join. Thank you for the panelists. Today, we're going to talk about housing. We're going to talk about affordable housing. And this is part of the Shine the Light series that SMBW puts on. It's a program that really started around looking at some diversity, opportunity issues in design as a profession. And we've gone on to make this a platform that we can focus on an issue every year. And so this year it is housing. And we have assembled a group of people here, some of whom that we kind of connect with directly and some who've come through others, but it's a group of panelists who participate in the affordable housing sphere a little bit differently. And so we've tried to create a group that everyone's got a different focus and is looking to solve different issues, but all around housing and stability in the community. So rather than me necessarily talking about what everybody does, I'm going to just introduce your name and just give you a minute to talk about your organization, how you participate, what your mission is, and then we'll get to the Q&A. So starting with you, Jovan Burton with Partnership for Housing Affordability. You want to take a minute and talk about your organization?
Sure. So Jovan Burton, Executive Director with the Partnership for Housing Affordability. We're a nonprofit here in the Richmond region that's focused on policy, research, and collaboration. So how we can work with other housing organizations and local governments and housing stakeholders to advance housing opportunity here in the region. We also operate a phone line called the Housing Resource Line that provides navigation for folks looking for existing housing services. And we have other programs that are really centered around collaborating around funding for housing development or just convening housing organizations in the region to just discuss industry issues and how we can move together forward. So happy to be here today and have a conversation with my other colleagues. Thanks.
All right, great. And we have two people from HomeAgain. I'll let Antonio Edgerton go first.
My name, of course, is Antonio. I am the Director of Shelter Programs at HomeAgain. We provide shelter services, community-based services for individuals experiencing homelessness or unsheltered. We also act as a resource of sorts to align our goals with Homeward, so we communicate with them. We refer individuals to resources that will help them maintain this in stabilizing housing.
Also, we have from HomeAgain, Mandy Herbert.
I'm Mandy Herbert, Executive Director for HomeAgain, and our mission is to assist individuals and families who are experiencing homelessness to secure and maintain a home again. And we operate 2 emergency shelters, one for families, the other for men and veterans. And we also have 2 community housing programs for rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. And we have been in the area since 1979.
Bernard Harkless with Lynx.
I'm Bernard with Lynx Ventures. We're a commercial real estate development investment firm that is really asset class agnostic. We do a little bit of everything, but recently we've had a pretty significant focus on doing affordable housing work. It kind of underlying, we're a impact-oriented for-profit developer, so we generally take a little bit more holistic approach to our development projects and focus on the economic side of small business growth and things as well.
Last, Sarah Hale with Urban Hope.
Hi, I'm the Executive Director for Urban Hope, and we are a faith-based affordable housing nonprofit. We are focused in the East End of Richmond. We provide primarily rental housing for people who are at or below 50% of the area median income. So in case you don't know what that is these days, it's about $100,000 for a family of 4 is 100%. That makes it easy. So people who make about $50,000 for a family of 4 per year. So people who are making less than that is primarily who we serve. We have single family houses, we have some duplexes and quads. It's a pretty small portfolio of 33 units, but we also have pathways to homeownership, and we put a lot of emphasis on financial health counseling. We have a cohort program that's more of a small group financial wellness effort, and we also have one-on-one counseling available and a public class that's available to all comers. You don't have to be affiliated with Urban Hope.
That's great. So thank you, panel. I really appreciate you guys joining us. And I think everyone listening can see that the idea of affordability, it's a really big bucket, and it involves a lot of different facets, a lot of different people, and facing different challenges around housing. And so, the group that's here really comes and tries, when you think about it in totality, people are plugging in different ways to support people as they onboard them to some more secure, stable housing. So we're going to really try to bucket this thing in three topics. Basic needs and the barriers for affordable housing, NIMBYism and community acceptance around affordable housing, and then goals and opportunities. And then if we have a little time, I think we'll just try to get the group to get into a little bit more freewheeling discussion and see how that goes. But starting out with affordable housing, kind of the basics and the barriers. Starting with you, Jovan, can you explain the different levels of affordability and kind of where affordable housing stands in Richmond today?
Thank you. So that's a good question. And I think in terms of understanding the basics, typically we're talking about folks that make at or below 80% of the area median income is usually what most funding streams are going to be based on. It's usually it's something that's decided by HUD every year for every region in the United States. So this gets updated annually, it increases annually, and it's based on household size. It gets pretty complicated because it is a number that changes, and there's percentage and there's jargon. So I think it's really important to understand that, at a very basic level, when we're talking about this and affordability, it just boils down to who's able to spend less than 30% of their income on housing and who is not. And more often than not, folks who are lower income are going to be spending upwards of 30, 40, even 50% of their household income on housing costs. About roughly a third of all households in our region are cost burdened or spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs. We even have over 50,000 households that are spending over 50% of their income on housing costs. So the lower you get on the income spectrum, the more housing instability that you see, the more difficult it is, the fewer units that we have. To put it just broadly, here in the region, we have about a gap on the rental side of 39,000 rental units. And that just means that, the number of folks who are living somewhere, currently renting somewhere that is not affordable to them, and there aren't any existing units that meet their income for them to not be cost burdened. So that's the challenge that we have. Big picture, I know that there's many nuances to it. It touches into homelessness, right? The lack of deeply affordable housing units that we have in the region makes homelessness that much more challenging to get out of. It makes shelter in much higher demand. So we have low inventory in both rental and and single family. We have rising costs on both rent and on this home purchase side, especially for first-time home buyers. We also have a spate of evictions that have continued to increase here in the region. So I think we have multifaceted problems, but at the core, it really impacts people at the lowest income level, which I'm sure some folks on this panel will discuss. There's also a lot of good things going on in terms of affordable housing here in the region. There are developments that are going up by nonprofits and for-profits that are either solely serving folks of lower incomes or that are mixed income projects. We're seeing more concerted funding as well at the local level in some cases towards housing specifically and homeless services, which is kind of a newer trend. So I think the pandemic helped with some of those things, but we continue to see a lot of challenges that will require collaboration, intentionality, and policy change in order to address.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Let me ask you, in your work, what do you run into that are barriers to approving and developing housing? I mean, I know you guys have had, for your size, a lot of growth in the last couple of years in the amount of housing that you've gotten under your control and been able to place in the community. But what are the things that are in front of you that make that difficult? And what are the barriers for those who are in need to be able to access, at least for your organization, the housing that you make available?
There we go. Sorry about that. It's funding. It all comes down to funding, which is not going to be a surprise really to anyone. I think it takes a lot of time to orchestrate deals, especially if there's government funding involved. It's a very slow machine. And I think also with government funding, you end up with these pro formas that to my untrained eye when I came into the business looked very bloated. So, but what they do is they mitigate risk for the lenders, but it also makes the costs just so much higher when you have larger reserves. And I don't want to get into that, but that's part of the challenge. So it adds substantially to the cost. And part of also the funding challenge is this concept of first money in. I have joked that I want to start a first money in foundation because funders will often say, well, we don't want to be first. We want to be the last money. And like, somebody's got to go first. How do you start? And so for small developers like we are, it's a challenge, but that's part of why we ended up with our private investment model that has proved to be really successful, which is whereby we take in promissory notes for flexible funding, and we issue 2.5% interest rate for over the course of 5 years. So during that time, we have flexible capital that we can use for acquisition. So that's our first money in. So that's a challenge. The cost of construction, I don't have to tell anybody on this call that it's expensive to build, and there's really no such thing as affordable construction. It's just construction. And so there are flaws in what the market will deliver naturally, right? So for-profit development kind of incentivizes against affordability. So we need to think about how to shape the market to get what we need. I think, as Bernard will attest, there are ways to do affordable housing for profit, but we've got to find a way to make it happen more. And we'll, I think, get to that a little bit later. As far as barriers for those who are in need of housing, it does come back to money primarily. I mean, some of it is information, people having their path to where do I even look to find a place that's affordable. But it's supply and demand. And there is sort of an inversion of the donut. If you've studied what has happened in cities, like for a while ago, there was an exodus out of cities. Now the cities are returning to being popular places to live. And what that gentrification does is it prices people out of the places where they've lived. So displacement is a big challenge. So I would say that it's for our people, it's money. So it's expensive to be poor. The solutions for people who are in financial crisis are very expensive. You can think about payday lenders and that sort of thing. And it's really hard when you get behind and you don't have the resources that people of higher means have. And then I also think it's challenging because some landlords cannot afford to be patient, like Urban Hope can afford to be patient. Some landlords, they just simply cannot afford to do that. So that's my answer. Money.
So, that's great. Bernard, I wonder, you've shifted some of Lynx focus to this affordability issue. And so Sarah talks about the patience, right? That it's got maybe a different rhythm to it or a different momentum to achieve some of those goals. How have you adapted your for-profit model to be able to meet some of those affordability things that you want to do if they do have different strategies or maybe different momentums to them?
Yeah, so our, even as being a for-profit developer, I probably should have prefaced this in my introduction, but we're generally a long-term holder of real estate. So what that inherently means is, for affordable housing developments where you have extended use agreements that are a minimum of 25 years and there's extended use for 40 or 50 years, like we're taking a longer term horizon on these things, which from our perspective, we spend a lot of time on thinking about partnerships and kind of like what the long-term investment actually looks like. So I wouldn't say that the approach has changed because we're working on affordable housing. Like that's kind of how we've always approached our development work is, we plan on holding these things for a long time. What are the strategic investments that make sense that may take 5, 7, 10 years to like really see the benefit of that. But when you take the longer time horizon, you generally just see different impacts, just practically speaking. I think one of the other things that we, because we historically have a background in doing just complex kind of tax heavy real estate type of investment work, which just generally has lended itself to affordable housing, as everybody knows here, there's just a lot of regulatory complexity to these things, as far as things you can and can't do and what the restrictions are on the financing and things like that. So some things that we've just been seeing recently as it relates to housing affordability is just as we've come out of the pandemic, the real estate market has been really great for everyone generally, right? People that own homes have seen their values increase. It's created barriers for, as Jovan said, lower income individuals or people on the lower tier of that. But the reality is like things are running really great now with the pandemic and with inflation and with the interest rate hikes and things like that. We've just observed a lot of our partners kind of doubling down on all of the compliance and all of the agreements and regulatory things that you have to really keep track of, which inherently means that things that may have been okay a year or two ago, and now it's like, well, these are the new requirements that your projects have to meet, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just usually when there's constraints on one end, you have to try and solve for it somewhere else. So it's just made things a little bit more difficult for us to kind of understand how to put the pieces together. But I will say that there's still, at least from we see, because people have identified it's an issue, there's a willingness to, from an affordability side of things, at least to try and get deals done. At least that's kind of our perspective. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of like, no, we don't want to do this. It's really, here are requirements, like figure out a way to make it work a little bit, which we can get creative on those things. But I have seen in the last couple of years a willingness from different types of partners to look at how to solve the problem, which has been interesting. That doesn't necessarily mean we've had like changes in outcomes yet, but I would say that as these additional requirements or new things have come up, there's definitely more groups that are at the table to talk about, well, how could they bring resources or capacity to help deliver more affordable housing projects?
Yeah, I'm curious. I don't want to sort of bias things one way or the other, but when you think about those partnerships and where the momentum is on coming to new solutions, is it primarily private sector groups, or is some of this coming out of whether it be local or state government? Is there any kind of innovation or energy coming out of that that's participating as well?
I think that there's just, and I'll say this, I don't think you kind of need all of those pieces, but I will say that your traditional places, like it's atypical for, it's just historically doesn't really happen for a for-profit developer to go talk to a foundation about innovative financing strategies for affordable housing. So like, it's not like our way's better or the other, but I think that because people are approaching things differently, it's kind of changing how people look at the problems. Like I'm a big believer in always like, we can you know, there's a huge issue with affordable housing, and, you know, nonprofits can't build it all. Like for-profits are going to have to build some of it too. And I think it's really about trying to find those partnerships, or where different groups, like everyone's doing what they do best, and we're kind of leveraging everyone's resources to get to better outcomes, is how I always think about it. Because as with the Partnership for Housing Affordability, it's like, it's a great, we'll call it politically objective organization that's just capturing data around the region to help people make informed decisions. So you're having them at the table with various localities, with, you know, for-profit developers and nonprofits, like foundations and philanthropy and corporate, like kind of getting all those people together is where the really interesting solutions, I think, will be.
Okay, great, that's helpful. So moving on a bit to you know, our topic of NIMBYism and community acceptance. Antonio, you know, this, I think we're not alone. You know, a lot of communities maybe look at affordable housing, they hear affordable housing, and there's a bit of a gut reaction that goes with that. You know, how does that that reaction to affordable housing kind of impact your work in trying to get momentum, move things forward?
Unfortunately, as adverse effect, I mean, it hurts us terribly, because opportunity to house families in localities that are near their school, near their work, unfortunately, do not fall in the areas in which the community is as accepting of our community. So it makes it difficult to broker relationships with property managers, try to reach out to private developers and things of that sort, and try to get them to buy into leasing to our community with the support that we've, you know, helped them attain through the process. So it makes it, it's a huge barrier, the lack of affordable housing, and not only just the lack of affordable housing, the locations of the affordable housing, and individuals wanting to seek better financial opportunities outside of their neighborhood. It's quite difficult.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I've always sort of thought that I wish we had a more integrated model as we think about affordability in communities, because of all the kind of great things that come from that,
Yeah.
all the collateral things that come from that. It's not even about affordable housing. And I sort of feel like, you know, I asked that question, I guess, in a bit of a negative way, but maybe another way to think about it is, you know, what are the tactics, strategies you're using to try to get people to see the benefits of integrating some affordable and having a community that's richer because it is on board with some of that.
Yeah, just changing the narrative and sharing our testimonials, because a bulk share of our participants are gainfully employed. They just had a bad opportunity with finances at a moment that limited their income, that subsequently forced an eviction, forced them to travel or move in a direction that they weren't projected to go before the pandemic. So I think advocating, communicating, having a message board like this to speak further into the community, to let them know that, like, these opportunities are not just wholesome opportunities, but they're economic opportunities for your community. Because we have individuals that are willing and ready to get out there and do the work necessary to bring this thing full circle.
You know, I'm curious, Mandy, you know, thinking about really the other end of that spectrum, homelessness, you know, what are the ways that you're working to kind of increase community acceptance and engagement with those who are experiencing homelessness? So you're trying to make that first step back into some housing.
That's a great question. So with the clients that we support, we really do not only take a housing first approach, we also work with them with very extensive case management services. So we are doing financial literacy, workforce development, we're paying for childcare expenses while they're out looking for housing. We're really covering all of that, including mental health. And then when the pandemic originally hit, and over the years, we've really seen not just our clients, but everybody struggling with mental health. So we have now brought in a partnership with an organization or a company called Family Insight, and we are providing counseling, whether it's individually or in group counseling, sessions for all of our clients. So we're not only looking for housing, we're trying to address any underlying conditions. And with that, it's also our responsibility to educate our community about our needs and the needs of our clients, and also share the stories of our clients. Just to give you an example, those in our family shelter this past year, over 90% are exiting into stable housing. They're doing very well. So we have to share with our community members, these are the services we provide, and actually give them the opportunity to come, for example, and visit a family shelter and volunteer, and actually just have the moment to sit down and talk with our clients and talk with our staff. I think once you break down some of those barriers and really bring that personal touch to the data, we start to see results, and we start to see our community members understand what we're trying to achieve. And then as a response, we are getting support for our mission.
So, yeah, I'm curious, there's a couple things here. I mean, it's the idea of NIMBYism, I think every community probably struggles with, and everyone's got to approach it differently. But you bring up a good point about education and those success stories. And I think, what people might perceive around homelessness or affordable or low income housing, what that looks like, what it means, is probably very different than the reality of it on the ground. And I'm curious how you educate people, how you advertise or share that success to try to change people's attitudes.
So one of the things is you just keep the conversation going with your community members. And, it's our hope in the future, we want to, for example, add something to our website where we actually have testimonials from our clients talking about the challenges and how, with our support, they've been able to come out of those and have a positive outcome. So it's really kind of understanding your community members, who you're talking to, and also knowing what stories to share. So right now, we all know we're dealing with inflation. Costs are extremely high. We're all feeling that, right? You go to the grocery store, you look at your bill. Every week seems to be a little more surprising than the last. But, because of that, we're seeing unemployment rise. I think everybody has either themselves experienced this or knows somebody who has experienced it. You are doing well for yourself. You're working full time. Things seem to be going well. And then when things like this happen, the unexpected can occur. So you have unemployment. You have people who are dealing with health issues, rare chronic conditions. It seems like over the past couple of years, those have seemed to increase. And the treatment for those types of issues are costly. So there are so many things that can lead to someone just not being able to afford rent anymore, not being able to afford their mortgage. And when that happens, people are really left in a tough spot. And so, unfortunately, we see that on our side that is increasing. In Richmond right now, the homeless population has increased. It's the highest it has been in 15 years. And I don't think it's a surprise to any of us as to why that has occurred. We've had a pandemic, we have inflation. It's one thing after another. And so it's our time to step up as a community, educate each other, be willing and open-minded to listen to each other. And then, like Bernard said, and Sarah and Giovanna said, let's sit down together and let's explore the options that we have to not only help those in need find affordable housing, but let's see how we can all work together to find a positive solution.
Before we leave this topic, Sarah, I just want to ask, you're now developing your own housing. If you have encountered any community resistance, have you placed properties in the market, or are you just in neighborhoods that has not necessarily been an issue?
I appreciate the question. I have to say, we really haven't experienced resistance. I think probably for a number of reasons. Most of what we develop is single family, and multifamily units that we do have either were already there, or we did have one where we did have to get a special use permit. I was kind of holding my breath on this one. It was a property we got from the land bank, and it was on a street that was well established. And I was kind of wondering what would happen because it came up that we wanted to build a duplex, and it appears to be a single family house, but all the neighbors were notified. And I was ready to receive some pushback, but we really didn't get any. And I don't know why. I don't know if it's just awesome people in the neighborhood or people were too busy to notice, or something in between. I think that I'm hopeful that more people are actually interested in helping to solve the problem. The other thing is we take a lot of care, and I don't really know what our reputation is. I know what I'd like it to be, but we take a lot of care in making sure that we are being a really good neighbor, not just in the way that, we keep up the properties, but our tenants are awesome people. And so for who we are working with, I don't think that we are perceived as risky to have around. I will say that that's probably harder for other organizations. When you're doing permanent supportive housing, it's hard in a single family, even a duplex type of situation, to manage some of the things that can come along with that. So it's trickier. And my hat is off to y'all, because it can be tricky.
Well, so having said that, let's talk about maybe goals and opportunities a little bit, and we'll open this up a little bit. But I know the whole country has been struggling with the affordability crisis, and every city, maybe has a different level of issue in terms of housing affordability and different strategies. But what is Richmond? As you guys look out on the landscape, what are the things that this city is doing well? And maybe I'll start with you, Bernard, because you're doing a little larger scale development and plugged into some of the more governmental agencies. What is Richmond doing well for affordable housing?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is having tools to more effectively develop affordable housing. And I think that's something that's definitely changed. There's been at the city specifically a handful of new people that have come to like the housing community development department. At least we found it's some people with more of a development background. Because the reality with a lot of this stuff is you can have policies, but like the boots on the ground of what those policies actually mean, how we build stuff, is kind of where some of that tension is, of like, this is what it's intended to do. Well, this is how it's actually impacting me or preventing me from being able to do the outcome we're trying to get to. So from my perspective, I've at least seen a willingness to try and solve for those things. Sometimes you get to there and the answer is no, or we can't change something. But I will say that there seems to be more of an interest in trying to put the right tools in place to facilitate larger affordable housing development. Because Jovan probably has this number memorized better than I do, but whatever the region is short for housing, you kind of you need to have both. You need to have the 200 plus affordable multifamily developments, but you also need the duplexes and the single family. So that's kind of where we see our role is, we're just we'd like to do larger multifamily affordable development, which, Sarah's not necessarily going to do. She's going to do the duplexes as single families, which is serving a different population, but we need both. And we can make a larger dent in that number when we can kind of get the tools in place to do larger developments, like some of the ones we're working on.
Jovan, you're more on the policy side. You want to address that question about things that we are doing well that you see?
Sure. And I think it's always good to have perspective on this, because I know we've talked a lot about, what the challenges are in the region, and, kind of Mandy mentioned some of the increases in homelessness. But, when you look across kind of the country, because every community is experiencing this challenge, we're in a much better place than a lot of other areas. And And I think that we should lean into that, and we should have a sense of urgency about that. If you look at cities, larger regions in terms of homelessness, I mean, we're doing pretty well. And there's obviously a lot of work to be done, but I think that should give folks a sense that it's not absolutely hopeless, and it's actually an issue that we can put a pretty big dent in and solve in some cases. So there's tons of things happening in the region, whether it's local government, nonprofit, philanthropy. So, I think just a few examples, we've seen more local government investment in housing. The city, for example, is exploring the idea of having using bonding for housing, and to have that be kind of a dedicated source of revenue towards housing. We also have Henrico County has a community reinvestment fund, or revitalization fund rather, to help with acquiring properties and investing in housing with flexible dollars that some of the federal funding just can't touch. We've been seeing things like mobile home redevelopment in Chesterfield County, with public-private partnerships between nonprofits and local governments. We've also seen more permanent supportive housing units come online, and some that are under construction right now, expansion of shelter beds in the case of Housing Families First, in the eastern end of Henrico. So there's a ton of things that are going on. I think the thing that's most important is understanding how long some of those things take, and just the scale that we need in terms of the issue. So it can take upwards of 4 to 5 years sometimes for a permanent supportive housing project to get built. And it's incredibly expensive to do and difficult to do. And so it's just, we need more support in that regard. And, NIMBYism was a conversation a little bit earlier, that is a large impediment to a lot of local policies that are supportive of greater housing, whether it's density, whether it's incentives and funding. Neighborhood opposition continues to be a big barrier. So I think if we can have more folks that are supportive of this and, can speak to why it's important for us to move together as a region, we'll see more successes.
So I'm curious, as you talk about that, Virginia is always a little different. Do the counties and the city cooperate? Do they share experience and strategies? Because it really is, we're like any city, even though we've got hard boundaries on the city, it does really encompass everybody. And you can't, just because you cross the city line doesn't mean the problem changed. So is there good cooperation? Does it feel like that, or is everyone trying to solve their own particular strategy for their county or city?
Yeah, cooperation has really increased in the last, I would say, 5 years, especially in the housing space. And I think in housing, and especially in homelessness, collaboration is actually required. It's mandated by the federal level, so that helps things a bit there. But in the housing space, collaboration is essential, because just to get a deal done, and Bernard and Sarah and others could tell you that how many different partners have to be involved in order for that to take place, whether it's philanthropy, local government. So the localities definitely, and I think with the pandemic, there's been some federal dollars where they actually have to work together on how are they going to spend this to, as a region, on some regional projects that you'll see, coming in the next few years. So they've had to collaborate a lot more recent years. You've seen things like the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust, which started in the city and it now has expanded to Henrico and Chesterfield. And that's also the land bank for all three of those jurisdictions. So there's been a lot of collaboration and kind of information sharing on, what we're doing well in certain places and what can be adapted elsewhere.
Thinking about, kind of next steps for how to solve the housing crisis. So, maybe Mandy, I don't know if you want to start with this, but, what are the next steps for combating the housing crisis in Richmond?
I think that we're well into that process currently. While we do have developers who are working on affordable housing, we all know that takes time. It's not something that you can rush. It needs to be done in time, and it needs to be done well. So the things that we're working on and that we've seen the city really encouraged about and pushing forward is how do we expand those temporary solutions in the meantime? So what can we run alongside of the affordable housing being developed? So that could be anything from expanding the homeless shelter capacity in Richmond. That's something that we're working towards and we hope to see in the near future. That could also be for providers like HomeAgain and our partners. What other supportive services can we weave into our programs to help our clients in the meantime while we're waiting for some of that affordable housing? We're still seeing movement to exits into stable housing, but they are staying in our shelters a little longer than we've seen in the past. But that's not necessarily a negative thing, because we do appreciate the time with them that we have. It's a little longer than normal, but we also have that opportunity to really dig deep and get down to how do we help them with the challenges that presented and cause them to, come to our doorsteps. So it's really looking at how do you expand, for example, your emergency shelter capacity? How do you provide additional supportive services? How can our partners come together? And how can we also, while we're doing that, contribute and have these conversations with our developers to help them better understand the evolving needs of these communities?
Bernard, do you have anything to weigh on this topic? I mean, when you think about, is there a strategy that we really haven't put out there yet that you're thinking about? Is there a participation from city or county government? I think about even things like, in places like DC, there's a real push to roll a lot of the old Class C office space back into the housing market. We're seeing a little of that here in Richmond, but do you have anything to add to Mandy's?
Not particularly. I think the biggest thing is, and I think localities kind of understand, and this is always the relationship between the complex web of limited resources and all of these things. But the reality of some of this stuff is that it gets to the philosophical question of is housing a right or not, and what role, it's kind of these underlying. We can talk about that all day long because people have different perspectives on it. But the reality is the system we've got, the market isn't going to build the housing. So if the market's not going to build it, how are you going to provide that housing to people? And it's historically been the low income housing tax credit, but so it's just a question of what tools, kind of as I said earlier, and Jovan said a little, what tools do localities have to actually help facilitate some of these things? So whether it's tax abatements or taxes, there's got to be a way, whether you're for profit or nonprofit, there's got to be a way, there's got to be more tools to bear that different organizations, whether it's philanthropy or localities, there's got to be better tools for us to try and build more product.
Got
Can
it.
I jump in
All
here? I just wanted to add on to what Bernard said. He said the magic T word, taxes. That's something that is, it's really a plague particularly for a small developer like Urban Hope. We keep our expenses as low as we can. That's our single biggest operating expense. And with the way that taxes have been going up for us, it's going to necessitate raising some of our rents if we don't get some kind of relief. And it's a cycle without logic, that we would pay the city a lot in taxes and then ask for it back so that we can build more affordable housing. And so we are working on it, but there needs to be a solution that works not just for small developers, but also for for-profit developers. If they're doing affordable housing, there should be something there. Of course, they've got LIHTC, different subject. But it needs to be something that's going to work for larger nonprofits as well. So there's a cost to the city, but anyway, we're working on it. But that's something that could really make a big difference if there was some relief in property taxes for units that are truly affordable.
I'm curious to really, uh, it's an interesting problem in the sense that is the city, I'll take the city as an example, do they have good outreach? Do they have, is there at least a conversation around, uh, the problem with that kind of trading of money and cycling it back and forth, uh, which just raises your cost incrementally in the near term to try to get it back and spend your time and energy to get it back in the long term. Do they engage on this subject or?
Yes, they are willing to engage, but it's very complicated because you've got the mayor's office, you've got city council, you've got the assessor's office, you've got the city attorney, you've got all kinds of people lobbying in different directions. So it's, I mean, it is so complex that I literally have to whiteboard who is saying what, who wants what, and what are our prospects. Of course, you've got limitations from the General Assembly. So there's code. And what is allowed and what is not allowed, and then if you're going to change the code or amend the code, and so it's really complex, but it's something that I'm working on. But the city, I think there is a willingness, but it's just so complicated, and there isn't one single entity that is leading in that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine for even some mid-sized organizations, it takes a lot of bandwidth and time that you're not necessarily focused on the problem at hand, which is delivering housing into the city because you're solving some of that stuff. Well, so in the time we have left, about 10 minutes, want to give the panel a chance to maybe kind of address some questions to each other and see what comes out of that. And maybe, Jovan, starting with you, I think you had a question that you wanted to put to Antonia.
Yes. So, I know that you talked a little bit about changing the narrative and kind of understanding the population that you all serve and homelessness. What is it about that population that, a lot of folks don't understand or get wrong? And, what's missing? What does the staff get to see every day that the general public does not?
Excuse me. Well, we get to see the true person that they present themselves to be, and not the representative that a lot of folks may classify them as or give them a bad rep regarding. We get to see the single mother who has 4 kids fleeing domestic violence, still going to school and still participating in a working class, trying to attain stable housing. We get to see the father who's out here working every day, but he has a criminal background, who's already has a predisposition of his own, really working towards maintaining the stability of not only his household, but his family, and trying to battle those obstacles. And we're able to see these things because we're right here in Ground Zero. We get to develop relationships with folks at their most vulnerable. And we establish this relationship by just being connected, being consistent, and listening. And through that, we're able to get rid of a lot of barriers. We're able to see the folks that they really are, instead of what they're classified as, because they don't have 4 walls to protect them from coping from the rigors of the day. Like me and you, we have opportunity to go home, and people don't get to see what we do when we go home. We get to chill, we get to play with our kids, we get to be upset, we get to really relax. But when you don't have a shelter, the community can see you sometimes at your most vulnerable and at your most worst when you don't have the people or the support that are necessary to help you pick yourself up. So I just think if we get away from looking at the negative ideations towards our community and towards that community in particular, then we can really develop a perspective of who is this person? How did they get there? And what are they really going through for us to see them like this? So I think that's the biggest takeaway our staff gets awarded with every day when we help break down a barrier, or we get to help them cope with something. Thank you for your question. That was an awesome question.
Antonio, you got a question for Sarah?
Yes, I do. How you doing, Miss Sarah? Good to see you. So, I mean, I know you spoke primarily on fundraising and how you're gaining support, but what are your biggest fundraising obstacles when speaking to possible donors? And if you could, what are some examples of how having a faith-based community supports you in your mission?
Sure. So back to my simple answer, just like in Sunday school, the answer is always Jesus. In housing, the answer is always money. Um, the I mean, when you're talking about housing, you're talking about big dollars, right? And so that is a challenge. But my answer to that is always yes, it's big money, but it's also one-time big money, if you will. Like when you build a unit of housing, yes, you're helping an individual or a family for that period of time. But what that stability does, it has ripple effects out. And then when that family moves out, another family moves in. So for however long that unit of housing is there, that one investment that feels so big at the beginning is actually having incalculable benefits. You can't tell how far the good is going. So that's my answer when it feels like it's just an awful lot of money. And then I would say for us in the way that we do business, taking in these private notes that we do, we have to do it more like on a pledge basis, because we don't want to take in people's money and then have a year or a year and a half go by before we're actually ready to start the development, because we're paying for that money. So timing is tricky. As far as having a faith-based community to support us, in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, we are all commanded in those religions to care for the poor, to look after and protect the poor. And so that's a kind of a no-brainer for people who are followers of those faiths. And Jesus has deep compassion for the poor and marginalized. So it's not a hard sell in our community. I also would point out that there's the concept of giving of your time and talent and treasure. And we see faith-motivated people all the time doing that in ways that are really breathtaking and humbling too. So it's an easy answer to say yes to something like Urban Hope. So I appreciate that. So, Spencer, you want me to ask Bernard a question, don't you?
If you have one.
I
If you don't,
do. No, I do, and I think I'm kind of freaking out because I think I might have forgotten to send the question his way, but it'll be an easy answer for you, Bernard. I want to know what you think about inclusionary zoning. I see that as a really important way for us to solve the affordable housing crisis. New Jersey they're leading the nation and affordable housing solutions, partly in large part, I think, because of that. So I'd like to know what you think of inclusionary zoning and how it would, what does that feel like how it would impact you and other developers?
Yeah, so I think as most things on the surface, I think it's a great tool, or what it's trying to do, I think it's great. I think the reality is that there's always the downstream impacts of what those things actually look like when you're trying to put them in place from a development perspective. So the way I kind of look at inclusionary zoning is more from a holistic economic standpoint, because we should have affordable units spread throughout the city, not just in qualified census tracts that historically have lacked investment. That's a good outcome we should have. But I look at these things more of how are we thinking about the holistic solution, which Antonio and Mandy kind of talked about a little bit. It's well, how can we think about investing in businesses differently and in entrepreneurship differently in historically underrepresented neighborhoods? So then in an ideal world, they also have housing choice because they've been invested in the workforce in ways that allow them to support themselves and pay the rent in different neighborhoods than where they may be living currently. So that's kind of how I look at it. I think that usually with inclusionary zoning, there's also the question of well, affordable for who and how deep is the affordability? Because a lot of the time you'll get inclusionary zoning and then you'll get affordable units, but it's only at 80% of AMI. And then people are well, that's not affordable. we want 30% aim. So I think that's kind of the trade-off with these things is, on the surface, this is a great policy to put in place, but is it really solving the problem of what we're trying to solve is also kind of how I look at it. I think it's part of the solution most likely, but there needs to be other things as part of that as well.
We like to say at Urban Hope, we need all the tools.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Say that about, we need all of it. Thanks.
Which I do have a question for Mandy to answer. So I know, HomeAgain's a housing first model primarily, but like, could you talk a little about, it's kind of ties to my previous response, but could you talk a little bit about how you talk about the relationship between like economics and homelessness, and, how can you think about investment in small businesses and things differently, and how does that impact the population you serve?
That is a good question, Bernard, and I probably could talk about this for quite a while, so I'll try to unpack it and keep it high level. But with economics and homelessness, there are a number of key factors that I want to touch on, and it's poverty, lack of affordable housing, you have unemployment, healthcare, mental health issues, and then you have systemic inequality. There's a lot there. So with poverty, and we've kind of talked about this throughout our conversation, it really comes down to families having the financial resources to help them maintain their lifestyle. There are so many things that have happened over the past 3 years where we've seen that families just aren't able to maintain those things. People have lost jobs. They either, might have lower wages, limited job opportunities. You have the rising costs of rent. So all of those things over time can push somebody below the poverty line. So that's one thing. And then lack of affordable housing, which we talked about, we are all communicating together. We know that is in the works and it does take time. But I think we all in this group have this at the top of our minds, at the front of our minds. But for example, a lot of our urban areas are being revamped. So that increases the cost for houses. It's also at times eliminating affordable housing where it currently stands. So we've just got to keep that in mind and keep talking about that as we look to develop affordable housing. Unemployment, I'm not going to spend much time there. I think that really does kind of go hand in hand with poverty. We were talking about that. There are just, financial hardships that hit oftentimes when you least expect them. So it's having us sit down with not just this group, but others outside of this group. How do we promote job growth? How do we prevent homelessness? How do we create opportunities? And Bernard, when I say create opportunities, it makes me think about the second half of your question, which is small businesses. So with our small businesses, they can really create a lot of opportunity for the homeless community. They, have the ability to not only open their business and thrive, but also that creates job opportunities for our community, for our clients. They can, with that, wrap in trainings and other support services. So I think that really is something that we should keep in mind, that these small business owners, they really do have the opportunity to help our clients maintain a steady income and get that training, get that experience. And then as a result, we're going to see our clients thrive, but we're also going to see our community go stronger because we had somebody in the community who's doing well, right? And understands how to help others. We had them invest their time and their resources in somebody else in our community, which therefore has just made it stronger and also created positive outcomes for these clients. So again, I could probably go on and on in great detail, but I think we've really touched the high points. So I think, my takeaway is we have so much opportunity here. And it really just starts with having those conversations. And sometimes they can be difficult conversations, but everybody here that I see, I know that we're having them, and I know that we're pushing through barriers. And we're having those difficult conversations. We're talking about it today, and we're educating our community. So that was a really good question, Bernard.
Well, I was gonna, Jovan was gonna have the last word on this, but we're out of time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And so I want to thank the panel that came today. I mean, I appreciate the energy. I appreciate all the ways that you're plugging into this issue and helping solve the problems. And for the people who joined the webinar, I do think that Antonio at least partly said it best. It's understanding this issue from the outside sometimes just takes knowing some of the people who are on the inside, and that connection, I think Sarah talked about this a bit, is what kind of makes it real and palpable for people, and it maybe changes your perspective on how we integrate affordable housing and get a more kind of vertically integrated community. So you can, people who are on the call, if you want to follow up with any of the panelists, their contact info is on the Shine a Light website. I encourage you to do so. If you see one of their developments or things that they might be doing in the community, I encourage you to go and participate. But thank you for joining us. I hope you got some good information out of it, and thank you again to the panel.